Thanks a lot. And I thank Jen Cohen at Searle and Claire Sanfilippo and Jess Dowd here at Georgetown for their hard work in organizing the evening. And I'm also grateful to Jacqueline Diaz for her media outreach and Kyle Bernardos for his IT wizardry, and to Inez Hill for her artistry with our flyers. Here's our plan for tonight. I'll open with some thoughts about how professionalism went awry after 9/11 at clandestine CIA sites around the world with disastrous costs for the rule of law. And then Alberto Mora will offer his reflections on this cost and the consequences and the lessons we might learn. He'll then introduce Yuri Belousov, Ukraine's lead war crimes prosecutor and investigator, who will join us from Kyiv. Next, Kathy Scott Clark, author of The Forever Prisoner, will introduce several minutes of clips. Actually, she will not introduce several minutes of clips. I will introduce several minutes of clips briefly. She'll talk about the clips after, from the HBO film by the same name that she produced, a film directed by the Oscar-winning Alex Gibney. We'll then seg to remarks by Kathy and then Mark Fallon, who will talk about both the closing of Guantanamo and the use of behavioral science in national security interviewing in the torture scandal's wake. We'll then finish with a panel discussion with Susan Brandon, Jack Clunan, Colleen Kelly, Andy Morgan, and Georgetown Law's own Elisa Massimino, all of whom I'll introduce later. We'll take some questions, both in person and online, perhaps especially online, from both panels, for both panels. Within our time constraints, we can run over by up to 15 minutes to 7:15. In January 2020, former CIA psychologist James Mitchell, architect of the agency's post-9/11 torture program, shocked observers at Guantanamo Bay, at Guantanamo's military commission hearing with his defiance. Mitchell, who as Kathy Scott Clark and others have documented, personally waterboarded Abu Zubaydah and others to the verge of drowning, told the judge and the world that he would, quote, get up today and do it again, unquote. And he characterized psychologists and physicians and other health professionals disturbed by the ethics of what he did as pussies. And he told the court that anyone concerned that his outrage over 9/11 might have clouded his professional judgment could, quote, kiss my ass, unquote. In 9/11's immediate wake, outrage and ambition and pressure to conform did indeed cloud the professional judgment of CIA and Defense Department psychologists and physicians. It also clouded the judgment and self-restraint of lawyers who told leadership at the CIA and the Defense Department and the President of the United States that torture was legal. And outrage, ambition, and pressure to conform distorted the judgment of professional society leaders who wrote ethical guidance that gave a wink and a nod to the psychologists and physicians who devised and oversaw the torture program. Then CIA General Counsel John Rizzo told me years back that had psychologists and physicians refused to participate in the agency's quote unquote enhanced interrogation program, it would have been shut down. But neither outrage nor ambition nor pressure to conform clouded the professional judgment of Alberto Mora, Mark Fallon, and Charles Andy Morgan, who are among the extraordinary professionals who resisted the creation of America's post-9/11 torture program and who are here with us today. And perhaps more remarkably, outrage and fear aren't distorting the judgment of Ukrainian prosecutors and investigators working with Yuri Belousov, who will join us live from Kyiv moments from now. In the face of existential threat to their country and danger to their own lives, they've committed to war crimes investigations and prosecutions that play by the rules of international human rights law, the law of armed conflict, and professional ethics. The US Constitution says nothing about professions or their governance, but America's post-9/11 misadventure in torture teaches a broader lesson about the vital role of independent professionalism in America's larger system of checks and balances. The torture program was made possible by a shocking failure of independent professional ethics governance. Well-functioning professionalism helps to keep state power from running amok, and it can safeguard sensible public policy against some of populism's more troubling influences. President Trump's first impeachment spotlighted professionalism's ability to check abuses of power. Trump's presidency survived, but his bid to condition $400 million in military aid to Ukraine on that country's launching of a sham inquiry into Joe Biden was foiled by career diplomatic and military professionals who grasped that such strong-arming was wrong. Presidential power proved too much for values inculcated over lifetimes of diplomatic and military service. Conversely, the professional self-restraint we expect from the bar proved startlingly absent among lawyers who took up Trump's quest to overturn the 2020 presidential election. Other checks and balances fortunately kicked in. Judges and election officials' commitment to constitutional duty stymied Trump's lawyers' fact-free efforts. The vital import of professionalism and the self-restraint that it demands is one of our central themes tonight. So is the grotesque misuse of behavioral science, which Kathy Scott Clark's powerful account of the events leading to the Guantanamo debacle reveals in unprecedented detail. And so is the potential for investigative strategies grounded in behavioral science and anchored in transnational law and ethics, potential to achieve both security and justice. Mark Fallon will speak to this potential as embodied in the Mendez Principles. Mark will also speak about the soon-to-be-released report of a bipartisan panel convened by Penn's Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law to create a roadmap for closing Guantanamo. But first, I'd like to introduce Alberto Mora, who will speak to the damage done by our misadventure in torture, and then introduce Yuri Belousov. Alberto was general counsel of the US Navy when shortly after 9/11, he learned of plans to implement enhanced interrogation at Guantanamo. Rather than going along, he prepared a memo concluding that this would constitute torture. As a result, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld delayed in signing off. For this act of dissent, Alberto became a hero to many, including me. He's since served as Walmart's general counsel and senior fellow at Harvard's Carr Center for Human Rights, and he currently directs the American Bar Association's Rule of Law Initiative. Alberto.
Great, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Delighted to be at this joint event sponsored by the Georgetown Law Center and by the University of Pennsylvania Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law. And it's also delightful to be here with so many friends and current colleagues and former colleagues, not only Greg, but Claire Finkelstein, Mark Fallon, Lisa Massimino, and others who've been deep and powerful voices on these issues since 9/11 or shortly thereafter. And those are the issues that fill the basket of what we call Guantanamo as shorthand for a basket of legal and policy issues which continue to be relevant to this day. Before I get started, though, let me clarify that I'm speaking today in my personal capacity, not as a member of the American Bar Association or an official of the ABA. My remarks will be brief because we all want to hear from Yuri Belousov, who represents the Ukrainian Office of the Prosecutor, and whose words to us will be important. Following 9/11 and the attacks on the United States, each of the friends I've mentioned and others present here today grappled with the legal and policy consequences of those attacks. Our presence here today is that we continue to grapple with those consequences. In the fear and fury that gripped our nation on that day, in our eagerness to protect our country and to strike back at the enemy, we lost sight of what in fact we were trying to protect. We forgot that our aim was not only to protect our fellow citizens, but also to protect our freedoms and our values. We forgot the wisdom in Albert Camus's comments that a nation fighting to defend itself should take care not to use those weapons that would destroy what it is trying to protect. What the United States always seeks to protect and foster is human dignity, the equal worth of every person from birth to death. And because we do so, we necessarily protect simultaneously freedom democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And yet, when we decided as a matter of state policy to torture Mohammed al-Qahtani in Guantanamo and many others at other Black sites around the world, we violated and damaged our laws and core values. When we failed to hold ourselves accountable for these actions, as we still do, this also constituted a violation of our laws and values. And when we sought to block other nations and the International Criminal Court from investigating these actions, we compounded our prior errors by wrongfully seeking to cloak ourselves in impunity, thus damaging the architecture of international law and human rights. We created precedents that licensed the abuse of human rights by other nations, fostered claims of impunity, and damaged the mechanisms of accountability that seek to hold nations and individuals responsible for wrongful behavior. Nations we seek to hold accountable, for example, such as Russia today and Vladimir Putin, as an example of those individuals. Presaged by Russia's unlawful occupation of Crimea in 2014, Putin's invasion of Ukraine on February 24th of this year was an act of blatant criminality. It is a war of aggression designed to expand Russia's imperial domains through conquest. And because Russia's rhetoric purporting to justify the invasion also denies Ukraine's right to exist as a nation, Ukraine's national identity, and the Ukrainian citizens' right to see themselves as Ukrainians, this war has also rightfully been characterized as containing genocidal elements. Russia's warfighting objectives include making Ukraine uninhabitable and ungovernable and destroying its economy. Committing war crimes are not exceptions, but part of the plan. Civilians are routinely targeted and killed. According to World Health Organization, more than 160 hospitals and medical facilities have been damaged or destroyed. More than 7.7 million people have been internally displaced, and more than 5.3 million refugees have left Ukraine. And the list of crimes goes on. As we all recognize, the war in Ukraine is not only about preserving Ukraine's sovereignty and independence, but also about protecting our shared values. It is about protecting and preserving human dignity, human rights, and the rule of law around the globe. This is why Ukraine must be defended and why Russia must be defeated and held accountable. For accountability to take place, national and international accountability mechanisms, including the ICC, will have to be strengthened. This is why this meeting today is important, both for the United States and Ukraine. For the United States, as is true of all countries, it's never to learn from our past mistakes. And impelled by lessons from the war in Ukraine, we can learn from our mistakes in Guantanamo and seek to correct them. Our unwillingness to confront the legacies of our use of torture must be overcome. Our assertion of immunity from accountability for the commission of war crimes needs to be discarded. And we must again assume a leadership role in the development of international criminal law, including by ratifying the Rome Statute. For Ukraine, there are also lessons to be learned in Guantanamo. The most important of these lessons is that despite the inhumanity displayed by the Russian foe, Ukraine should take care not to succumb to inhumanity, meaning it should not use those weapons that would destroy what it is trying to protect. With this, let me introduce our next speaker, Yuri Belousov, who is one of the senior Ukrainian officials assigned the responsibility to help ensure that Ukraine lives up to its values. Yuri heads the Department of Counter-Reaction to Human Rights Violations within the Ukraine Office of the Prosecutor General, rising to the position after 15 years of experience in law enforcement and human rights advocacy. Since February, when the active phase of the war with Russia began, Yuri's department is focused on conducting effective investigations on torture and forced disappearances and other forms of deprivation of liberty by Russian soldiers against Ukrainians. Thank you. And Yuri, the floor is yours.
Dear colleagues, due to some connection problem, let me first try to show up, but not maybe for a long time, just to say hello to everyone. And then maybe you mostly will see my picture and hear my voice and live, if you don't mind. Did you hear me properly now?
Yes.
Okay, now, thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to attend such an important event, because it's always better to to study international experience to avoid some mistakes being committed, and from the one side and from the another, to use best practices we could share with our law enforcement. And just to add to what already been said, Ukraine is facing huge challenges, and so everyone knows about the war, about people being dying every day. But I would like to say some words about other challenges, because there is a risk when you're touching the evil, or to be a part of it, or to start to behave the same way. Because our people pretty often says, okay, why should we take care of prisoners of wars? Because they just killed our people, they killed our children. Why should we treat them properly? Why should we follow rules or human rights standards or whatever if they don't do that? And the level of hate is so high among the population, and even among law enforcement officers. That's why it's pretty hard to persuade them that, guys, the challenges Ukraine faced, it's a combat of two different civilizations, actually. And, even for us, a lot of Ukrainians for a long time considered Russians as really not like brothers, but close neighbors. And what we're facing now, we just have to understand how different we are, and in terms of culture, in terms of everyday life, in terms of human rights standards, and in terms of humanity approaches or whatever. And now as colleagues who presented me before February, so we were investigating human rights violations committed by Ukrainian law enforcement officers, abuse of power by patrol police or by investigators who tortured someone to get the information about the crime being committed. But now we understood that what we had before is just incomparable with what we have now. Our people didn't get used to see how bad situation could be. And that's why we need to adjust our mind, to adjust our standards of work to the reality that significantly changed. And coming back to human rights, it's not just the expression, or it's not just two words, it's approach we still try to follow in these difficult circumstances. That's why we really appreciate the support of United States, definitely, in terms of equipment and support with the technical solutions, let's say, for our army, but also with the standards of treatment and investigation. That's why, coming back to the topic, to your experience of having Guantanamo, it's why it's so important to put this, to forget about this page of the history, because such kind of practices could be used by Russians as a justification of their actions. They just could say, okay, guys, why are you asking that we are keeping someone incommunicado, as they do right now, actually? If there are some examples from other countries, and they could use such situation or such examples as Guantanamo to justify their actions. Even from this perspective, it's so important for you to follow your way, what you want to do. You want to get rid of this practice you still have. And it's really, really, really important, because, as I said, so Americans was always, and still is a good example for Ukrainians as like a country of liberty, the country which lives with absolutely different standards which we want to have in our country. And that's why we really use it as an example. And this practice, and I really appreciate that you could openly talk about such dark pages, or how to say, about your history. You could tell about freely about this, and we also want to do this. And coming back to the situation briefly, that's not very briefly, sorry, what we have now, it's really difficult somehow to persuade people that we shouldn't do the same as Russians do against us. And sometimes it's difficult to explain why we should follow different standards. If they kill us, why shouldn't we do it? If they torture our people, why shouldn't we do it? And we just really tried to say that during the interview, why you should follow investigative interview standards, why you shouldn't violate human rights because you're a person of different kind. So we are a civilization of different kind. And when we see that human rights violations and the scale of human rights violations really depend on the level of living of people and we see how we would expect in which terrible standards people live in Russia. We didn't know what I would explain what I mean. So we as a neighboring country, we never knew that when they would come to our houses, some of them never used toilets, for example. Just sorry for such an example, but that shocked our people. Or they were trying to find the video recorders. They came with video cassettes and they tried to find the video recorders for video cassettes, which the guys with 20 years wouldn't use it. And this level of very low level of culture of Russian people all across the country had an influence on us because they see the different level of culture. And for normal people, it's okay if you see someone living with the highest standards. You just try to do this to have the same standards. But for Russian, I don't know why, for Russian soldiers, when they see the neighboring country living with the high standards, they just want to destroy that. And but they approach how they treat their neighbors. But for Ukrainians, we really need good examples. We need good examples, good practices, and even if we know that some countries faced some bad stories, but they don't try to hide it. They try to overcome and come to next level, and to show these examples to the children. Say, guys, yeah, we had these stories, but we managed to overcome it, and now we live with a different standard. That's why, guys, let me wish you to find the solution to this difficult situation with Guantanamo, and it definitely will help you at the whole country, and it will help to other countries who would follow your example. Thank you for such an opportunity for me to participate. It would be a great pleasure for me to answer any questions. I would try if you have any. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much, Yuri. And
thank you, guys.
That's pretty moving stuff, especially when you observed the potential for Russia to point to Guantanamo as an example of why they perhaps should get away with things that they are trying to get away with. We hope very much that you can join us. I'm not sure what the technology will permit, but hopefully you can stay with us, although I recognize that it is now, 2 a.m., 2:30 a.m. Your time. So we understand if you need to get to sleep. We are going to turn now to some clips from Alex Gibney's documentary by the same name as Kathy Scott Clark's wonderful book, The Forever Prisoner. And we'll wait on discussing the substance of the book until Kathy and Mark Fallon come up right after these clips. And so I'm not going to say more about the clips. They speak powerfully for themselves.
You call this guy Boris. Is Boris his real name?
No. I cannot talk about him, and I cannot even mention his real name.
This is Boris. His real name is James Mitchell. He also wrote a book about the interrogation of Abu Zubaydah. But Mitchell's book had the full cooperation of the CIA, because Mitchell was the inventor of EITs, the acronym for what the CIA called enhanced interrogation techniques, and what the rest of the world called torture.
If my boss tells me it's legal, especially if the president has approved it, I'm not going to get into the nuances about what some guy in the basement or what some journalist thinks about it, because they're free to trade places with me anytime they think they can do a better job of protecting Americans.
While Abu Zubaydah is in the hospital, things begin to change. It's during this period of time that Jim Mitchell is sent to the detention site. He goes merely as an observer and to provide feedback to CIA headquarters. But his influence becomes very clear. They talk about returning Abu Zubaydah to the detention site in an all-white room, which is very bright, kept cold. He'll be kept naked and sleep-deprived. These are the ideas that are coming about. Even though he's not particularly doing the interrogation, these are his ideas that he's pushing forward.
So they decided to go back to the louder music, the same song again and again and again, very loud.
Do you remember what the song was?
I think it was Red Hot Chili Peppers. That's the only CD that somebody had, something like, so it's just going around.
What I got, you got to give it to your mama. What I got, you got to give it to your papa.
I used to like them until now. I never listened to them again.
Give it away, give it away, give it away now. Give it away, give it away, give it away now. Give it away, give it away, give it away now. Why can't tell a fuck, I keep it on
The Justice Department said you could waterboard from 20 to 40 seconds, give them 3 full breaths, and then waterboard again for 20 minutes. The first time we waterboarded Abu Zubaydah, it was clear to me that that was too much water and it was too long. So what we did was we cut back to pours that were 8 seconds. You can easily hold your breath for 8 seconds. And then there were 2 pours that were 20 seconds and 1 pour that was 40 seconds. That's the number of times it was poured.
We know now that he was waterboarded 83 times in the month of August alone. And what the waterboarding is, right? Sometimes you'll see it described as simulated drowning. There's nothing simulated about it at all. It's drowning, right? You are strapped to a board, your legs, your chest, your arms, and your head is strapped down. So you cannot move, you're utterly immobilized. And your neck is lower than your feet. Then they wrap your face in something to obstruct breathing, but that allows water to pass through. And then they pour water up your nose and down your throat so that you breathe the water. And if you breathe water, you will drown. And so straining against the straps, unable to move, you begin to drown. And the art of this particular torture is to know just the moment when the brain convinces the person they are about to drown, you are about to die. And at just that instant, when you have just given up into hysteria because you are about to drown, that's when they raise the board and you vomit. And just as you take the first breath, they put it down again and they do it again.
In America, we have this thing called innocent until proven guilty. If we think they're guilty of something, we should take them to trial, give them opportunity to be heard, sentence them accordingly, and send them on their way. It's just inhumane to detain someone and not give them rights, period.
Thank you. Well, I can thank Kathy for helping to bring this wonderful film to us as a producer on this documentary. And Kathy and Mark, come on up. Come join us. You have your name tags with you. Great. Okay. Kathy Scott Clark is an independent British investigative journalism superstar who's written multiple path-breaking books on the war on terror, including The Forever Prisoner, which received a glowing review from the New York Times just a few weeks ago. And Kathy, as I mentioned, also produced the HBO documentary, The Forever Prisoner, with Academy Award-winning director Alex Gibney. Mark Fallon was a career Naval Criminal Investigation Service special agent, chief investigator for the Guantanamo military commissions, and past chair of the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group Research Committee. The High Value Detainee Interrogation Group, or the HIG, as folks in the know it, was and is a collaboration amongst the FBI, the CIA, and the Department of Defense. Mark's the author of the book Unjustifiable Means, which you should all read, which came out a few years ago, and which offers shocking new background and insight on America's post 9/11 descent into torture. Mark serves on the steering committee for the Mendez Principles, about which he will speak, the Mendez Principles on Effective Interviewing. And he's interim executive director of the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law at the University of Pennsylvania. It's all yours, I might pose a question or two, and we may have some questions from our online audience, and maybe some time for questions for those of you who graced us with your in-person presence as well. Kathy, your thoughts?
Conversation, aren't we?
Yeah, so we thought we'd have a conversation about some things that have occurred. So let's look historically at kind of what happened, because Kathy, in her amazing book, is able to illuminate the darkness on areas that I'm unable to talk about. She can say things that I cannot say, and I am prohibited from writing about things that she has written about. And so if you look at this torture program, and it was a torture program, EIT was a term that they just made up. Within the military, it was called SEER at first, until they started to call it counter-resistance techniques. But this was a program that was developed within the United States government as an instrument of warfare, as an instrument of national policy that was implemented differently within different agencies within the government. And that is what is so special about Yuri Belousov and what they're doing in Ukraine now. Under an existential threat, they are still seeking to apply the Mendez Principles on Effective Interviewing in order to ensure that as they're trying to preserve democracy, they are also preserving the rule of law and acting in a humane manner. And that is frankly what we failed to do after 9/11, when decisions were made based on fear and fury, as my dear friend Alberto Moro likes to say, ignorance and arrogance. And we went down this dark abyss thinking that we can implement this program of dehumanizing people and hope that we would set the conditions that would be so depraved that they would be conditioned to answer in the manner in which that we wanted them to answer. And so looking at that and the illumination in Kathy's book, I'd like to turn to a particular incident that was a turning point in my career. And it was in October of 2002 when a CIA lawyer named John Fredman came to Guantanamo Bay and explained what the EIT program was. And he said that it would make the lymphatic gland react as if you were drowning, but you probably won't drown, but you should have medical personnel there just in case. So you've expanded upon John Fredman and his background a little bit more. Can you talk about who John Fredman was and what his role was in implementing the state-sponsored torture program that worked within the agencies in the United States?
Well, Jonathan Fredman was the chief lawyer in the Counterterrorism Center on 9/11, and his wife, Judy Phillipson. Can you hear me now? Okay, I'll start again. John Fredman was the chief lawyer in the Counterterrorism Center at the CIA on 9/11, and his wife, Judy Phillipson, was a psychologist at the CIA who knew James Mitchell. James Mitchell was already working on contract for the CIA on prior to 9/11 on various psychological related issues and how to size up your enemy and how to deal with your enemy on a psychological basis. She asked Jim, as I call him because I knew him very well, she asked Jim in December 2001 to analyze a captured Al-Qaeda, a so-called Al-Qaeda training manual, which he did with his working partner at SEER, Bruce Jessen.
Could I just ask a question? What was his background in counterterrorism or knowing the Middle East?
He didn't have any. He worked in the SEER school the US Air Force SEER School in Spokane, and they called their SEER school Spokanistan, and they had fake decals and Red Army style uniforms, and basically it was a stan in the woods outside of Spokane city. So he had no particular knowledge of Al-Qaeda or Islam or 9/11, post 9/11 terrorism.
And just to reinforce that, and that is who the CIA asked to analyze the Manchester document.
Yes.
Okay.
And if you read the bits of of his analysis that have been declassified, he and Bruce say that it didn't matter that they were not experts in those particular fields, because what mattered was that humans act in the same way, irrespective of their background, religion, race, etc., etc. So the CIA thought a lot about this document that they produced, which basically also recommended possible techniques to deal with resistance-trained Al-Qaeda suspects. And they latched onto the fact that Jim and Bruce were doctors of philosophy, but they were doctors. And Judy Phillipson introduced Jim to her husband, Fredman, who worked for Jose Rodriguez and Kofa Black, who were looking for a solution of who to use to interrogate high-value Al-Qaeda detainees once they had any. And when they captured Abu Zubaydah, who was allegedly the first high-value detainee, who was not really anything that they presented him as, they pulled Jim in and he signed a contract and he was on the plane to Thailand the same day. Sorry.
So would you explain, Kathy, what SEER is?
SEER is survival, evasion, oh my God, let me get resistance and escape. It is the US military's survival school. Each arm of the military has their own survival school. And the one that Jim and Bruce Jessen worked for was the Air Force One. And you go along for, I think, a 17-day course where you start off, as Jim describes it, doing bugs and berries. So you get dumped in the middle of the forest and you have to survive. And then you get kidnapped and hooded and sleep deprived and strung up and bare bones diet or no food whatsoever. And then you get slapped about and you get put into a water vat with the lid on. There are other various forms of water torture, but not a water board specifically. And then once you have been beaten into submission and you give up the secret that you were given at the beginning of the course to keep guarded as long as possible, you then get taken to the resistance training lab, where you are put in an all white room with CCTV monitoring. It's very cold, no food, similar to how Abu Zubaydah was treated. And you're then taught the tools to come back from the brink and to recover. And basically they recreated this lab in Thailand for Abu Zubaydah, and they did all of the first bit to him, but they didn't give him the tools to come back. They basically pushed him over the edge.
And who gave this training? So this really was an interrogation training to elicit information. This was a conditioning training, correct? To try to inoculate them
Yes.
about the type of conditions that they would receive
Yes.
if a brutal adversary had captured them.
Yes.
So it was not a process to elicit information.
No, not at all. And you should be talking to Andy Morgan over there when he gets up, because he is a far better expert in this area than me.
And so who did this training for the CIA when they were first trained in how to implement these techniques? Do you know the agency that did that?
It was a Joint Personnel Recovery Agency, and Jim and Bruce's old friends from SEER School.
Right, the JPRA. So let me just interject a little bit into your story, because our stories intersect here. Shortly after 9/11, there was a meeting up at the University of Pennsylvania at a house, and it was called Academics on Patrol. And they talked about implementing learned helplessness, this theory of positive psychology, I guess, from Martin Seligman up at UPenn.
Who's still there?
Who's still there.
Have you met him yet?
I have not. I have not. And I haven't seen him around campus. And so this theory of learned helplessness
was what I say was added, was the enhancement to the SEER program. But when they wanted to implement this, I think it's important for the audience and listeners to understand is the same instructors that instructed the CIA instructed the people at JTF Gitmo. The same exact instructors. It was not.
And in Iraq as well.
And in Iraq as well. Yes, you could say that. Kathy said that. And so let me interject.
Sorry, and Bagram in Afghanistan as well.
Thank you. And so I was paid a visit when I was the deputy commander and special agent in charge of the CITF, the agency responsible for bringing terrorists to justice for military commissions. And a guy named Dan Baumgardner, the chief of staff from the JPRA, visited me in my office in Fort Belvoir, Virginia. He explained to me what the SEER program was, and he asked me if I wanted to use SEER. And I had told him, I really don't think of our guys as the first wave being captured. I really don't think that they'd like to be subjected to that. And so, no, thank you. And he said, no, as an interrogation technique. And I said, you just explained it to me. It is not an interrogation technique. And secondly, I do this for a living. I know how to question people. So I thanked him very nicely because I had a lot of people coming to me asking me if they could help. And I just thought he was, frankly, an idiot who wanted to be helpful, never realizing that in his Senate Armed Service Committee hearings, he said he also brought that same brief to the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and he also brought that brief to what he called OGA, another government agency, and this was
the CIA,
the torture program. Yes. So can you talk a little bit more about the application on Abu Zubaydah?
Before I get into that, I mean, you made me think of one thing about the training within the CIA program. I spoke to Chris Wirtz, who was one of the trainers, who Jim really does not like at all. And he said that they had a problem training waterboarding because nobody at the Air Force School in Spokane had ever done waterboarding because it was an exclusive technique used in the Navy School in Brunswick. And so Chris's job was to go and persuade an old trainee waterboarder who still lived in Spokane and had done it in the 1960s when the Air Force did do it, to come and teach the CIA how to waterboard. And this guy was already very old, but that was as close as they got to actually having someone who had done official waterboarding to teach the CIA people how to do waterboarding on real detainees, which I was quite shocked about.
Yeah, and actually the Navy was the only service that, and they actually stopped doing waterboarding because the SEALs capitulated. It did not do its intended purpose in giving them confidence when they got out because they just told everything. And so Mitchell and Jessen, you're saying, didn't really invent anything. They just took what they had and applied it. So it wasn't reverse engineered, it was just applied.
It was applied in the real world. They basically took Abu Zubaydah to SEER school in Thailand and they recreated Spokanistan in Chiang Mai.
And what were they paid for taking this government program and giving the government program to the CIA?
I think when they were actually out as individuals originally, they were paid $1,800 a day plus expenses. And the company they formed later on to run the entire Black Site program was paid, I think, 81 million in total. But Jim would always say that that was not money that was paid to him as a person or Bruce, that was money that was paid on to their employees.
Yeah, the Saturday Night Live did a skit one time about Mitchell and Jessen, and when they asked him about that amount, they said, the actor said, "Oh, we had a split between two of us." Actually, the contract was for $183 million, yes. I believe. After Abu Ghraib broke, the CIA canceled that contract and decided that.
No, the contract continued till January 2009 when Obama came in, President Obama, sorry. But they had another 2 years of options that would have taken them up to the total amount.
Mark, I'd like to ask you a follow-up question and give you an opportunity to speak to the Mendez principles. The Mendez principles lay out a strategy, amongst other things, a strategy of national security interviewing, which draws upon behavioral science. So could you say some things about what that strategy is and how, for those who might be at best unfamiliar and at most skeptical, how the Mendez principle's reliance upon behavioral science differs from what Jim Mitchell purported to be his reliance on behavioral science in his method?
Sure, I'll give you a little background on the Mendez principles because a number of people are on the advisory council, including yourself, Susan Brandon, and Yuri Belasov are on the advisory council. The 80 people from 40 countries on the advisory council of the Mendez principles on effective interviewing. And I am on the 12-person steering committee selected of global experts that worked 4 years on the development of the Mendez principles. And they have evolved since 2016, when Juan Mendez was the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, delivered a thematic to the United Nations. I was a special advisor to Professor Mendez at the time. And what he called for was a universal standard, that we needed a global standard to interview people humanely and lawfully. What I interjected into that, based on my experience working with the Hague Research Committee, was that it should be based on science. And I spoke at the UN General Assembly at a side event in 2017 with the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. And what I explained was that had I had the research that is available now, I may have been more persuasive. Alberto Moro and I may have been more persuasive in convincing seniors within the Department of Defense not to go down the torture abyss. But at the time, we did not have the science available to us. So I was trying to fight based on my experience, that my work with the I-49 squad with the JTTF FBI on the turf stop case, and my work on the USS Cole case gave me this experience base to say that this was the way to do business. That was not an effective argument when the CIA was saying, but our methods are more effective because it was all classified and secret.
So here's Mitchell claiming earlier on that he's using his learned helplessness model, plus research dating all the way back to studies of how US servicemen were broken during the Korean War. Then here later on, Mitchell is claiming that he's using some combination of Pavlovian and operant conditioning. That was his argument when he testified at Guantanamo 2 years ago. In what way is the psychological theory, the psychological model behind the Mendez principles of cognitive interviewing, et cetera, in what way does that differ from Mitchell's claims?
Yeah, Mitchell's claim was a conditioning. It was about compliance. Effective interviewing is about cooperation. Cooperation is volitional, right? You have to want to cooperate. If I want to know what you know, you're going to have to want to tell me, right? I can't force that out of you. Plus, if you look at how memory works, you want to kind of depressurize so that you would remember things. Oftentimes, you're trying to look into people's past. And so what the sciences tell us is that the information gathering methods, whether you call them relationship-based, rapport building, those methods are more effective in obtaining more reliable information, less false and fabricated information, and more overall information. And so from a counterintelligence perspective, you're looking for data so that you can connect the dots. So you want to get more overall information if you're looking at a threat matrix so that you can determine where that information may be, what you may apply it to. And so that's some of the beauty of the Mendez principles is it is human rights compliant, it is lawful, and it is based on science.
If I can add also, I don't think one thing that's never really been considered is how much money and manpower was wasted by the CIA and information passed to other government agencies based on false confessions and false claims made by detainees from Abu Zubaydah to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Ramzi bin al-Shid. I mean, everybody made false claims to stop the torture, and months of time and effort was wasted chasing down bullshit stories, I'm afraid.
Right. Yeah. And there were a number of those, and the threat level kept going up. People may not have realized at the time why the threat level was going up, but it was because of false and fabricated information. And people ask me. Okay.
I was just going to say that there's a funny point in the film where when we interviewed Steve Gowden, and he explains that he was talking to Abu Zubaydah one day about kind of, well, in theory, what kind of, if you were going to attack America, not that you are, what kind of things would you attack? And he allegedly, I mean, he can't speak for himself, so this is all third hand, obviously. He allegedly said, well, what about the Statue of Liberty or the Brooklyn Bridge? And Steve says, we saw on CNN like 24 hours later that the CIA has leaked this information to the media. And the media is now running stories about how the Brooklyn Bridge and the Statue of Liberty have been closed because of a terrorist threat. It's just crazy.
Kathy, as you point out, Andy Morgan, who's going to join us on our next panel, in real time back then, shoots down the science behind the scientific claims that Mitchell was making. And yet this guy was an astonishing success, at least within the system. Kirk Hubbard once told me that he was convinced that James Mitchell was the smartest guy he ever met. What did Mitchell have going for him? Charisma, persuasive power. What was it that enabled him to pull this nonsense off?
He had, as Jose Rodriguez likes to say, he had the relevant expertise, and the expertise that they wanted was SEER. Because if you can torture American service personnel legally, then, and they can withstand it, because apparently there isn't any data to suggest it has any long-term effects or leads to people killing themselves, which I think Andy will dispute, then it's perfectly legal and okay to do it against real Al-Qaeda suspects. Because if our guys can withstand it, they can definitely withstand it because they're resistance trained as well.
But shouldn't the fallacy of that have been transparent? That obviously the trainees know it's part of a training program, yes. And quite obviously, Mr. Zubaydah or anyone else in detention hasn't a clue as to what's going to happen.
Or how long it's going to last, or whether it's going to go on forever, or whether they're actually intending to kill him at the end of it.
Yeah.
And the students know there's a safe word. You say flight surgeon and it ends.
Yeah.
And it always ends after 17 days anyway.
Let's take a question from the in-person audience, and let me look for hands. Let's see. Yeah, Claire. Let's wait till the mic comes down so that we can get you into the.
Jesus Christ. Yeah.
Yeah, step away.
Yeah. I was not expecting that.
We're not really trying to shoo you away here.
Thanks so much for this really fascinating discussion. Your combined expertise is so incredibly helpful and interesting to hear. I have talked to a number of people who have been through the SEER training, and I've heard a variety of reactions. One reaction I've heard is, it wasn't that bad, being waterboarded. And I've also heard people say, you know, when they did it in interrogation, it was very, very different. Kathy, your remarks suggested it was really lock, stock, and barrel the same thing, but I wonder if you could talk about the differences between the way it was used in the SEER program and the way that it was used in interrogation.
So the rules for Navy waterboarding was, I'm going to get this slightly wrong, but it was a maximum of 2 pours and a maximum of 1 time on the waterboard, although you can threaten a person a second time with putting them on the waterboard. There were, I think it was a maximum of 1.5 pints of water, which was not to go up the nose or down the throat. It was to be poured very lightly. And a cloth or a bag on the head was not supposed to get completely soaked. So Abu Zubaydah's waterboarding, if we listen to what he has to say and also to declassify the CIA records, went on for 17 days. Most sessions lasted for 45 minutes to an hour. Some days he was subjected to 3 or 4 sessions within a 24-hour period. In between the sessions, he was also being subjected to other enhancing techniques like being starved, freezing cold, naked, strung up, threatened, beaten, walled, numerous other nasty things. And also the amounts of water were extreme, and the desired effect was to get as much water into him as possible and to soak the cloth. And when they finished, sometimes they left him strapped to the board with the cloth on his face. And I think with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, it was even worse. I think they used on one 24-hour period something like 84 gallons of water. So there is no comparison whatsoever. And in fact, when Mitchell was giving testimony in January 2020 at Guantanamo, this phrase came up that no one really took much notice of, but I found truly shocking. This was him describing Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's waterboarding. And they had this phrase called goofy duck lips. So they would hold the lips up to form like a pool. So when the water went in, the water actually went in. It didn't slide down the side. So he claimed that that was not his invention, but he used the phrase. So no comparison.
Kathy, we've all stayed up late, and so people talk about sleep deprivation. Could you describe how sleep was deprived?
Well, this was a standard technique, so you didn't even need headquarters approval to do this, up to 72 hours. And the way to effectively sleep deprive someone and not have to sort of drag them around the cell for 72 hours is to hang them up by their wrists like that. So if you fall asleep, you then collapse on your wrists and you wake yourself up, which involve less sort of like hands-on with the detainees. Jim also said that the official version was that your hands had to be out here, and there was a long discussion about this at Guantanamo. But I think if you look at the scars on detainees' wrists, even to today, you'll see that it was like that. So, and you didn't need official permission to do that. You could just do it in a black site.
It's worth pointing out for extended sleep deprivation, a core precept of the cognitive interviewing style that is at the foundation of the Mendez principles, that is evoking memory by giving people certain memory cues, is that people have to be with it enough to construct and develop, set out a coherent narrative of what they remember. And of course, extended sleep deprivation, this is something we don't need behavioral scientists to teach us. We don't need sleep labs to discover. We all know this. When we've had extended sleep deprivation, even say an all-nighter, let alone, my God, 72 hours or more of sleep deprivation, extended sleep deprivation leads to a breakdown of the ability to put a cognitive chain together and to recount events, which would seem to be pushing exactly the opposite direction of getting the kind of coherent information you'd need for either intel or criminal investigation purposes. Yeah.
One thing to point out that was by the time they got to the black site in Poland in March 2003, sleep deprivation and other conditioning techniques were used as a matter of course on new detainees for something like 2 weeks before they even started interrogating them. So by the time these people were asked questions, they were already subjected to multiple enhanced interrogation techniques that were technically standard.
And Kathy, would you expand upon conditioning and then debriefing? Because debriefing is the interview process, right? That Jim may or may not have done, and the conditioning was done separately, correct?
Well, we're now getting into kind of all these strange euphemistic terms. I mean, debriefing and interrogation, as far as I'm concerned, aren't different at all. In Guantanamo in January 2020, the government produced a list of unique functioning identifiers, I think, and this was to protect the people who had tortured, protect their names. And at various stages, Jim was asked to describe who these UFIs related to, whether they were debriefers or interrogators or psychologists. And it became quite clear that debriefers became interrogators and psychologists became debriefers and psychologists became, it's all scrambled up. It was just words.
One of my greatest disappointments in this entire process was when I went to the Assistant Director for Counterterrorism of the FBI and asked for his help in trying to subvert torture in the Department of Defense. He turned his back on me. He said, "Mark, I can't help you. It's a DOD issue." Could you explain to us the role of the FBI in some of these programs?
That's something that's still being investigated now. And I don't think anyone really has seen the full picture. I mean, obviously the FBI interrogated Abu Zubaydah first, but he will contend that they treated him almost as badly as Mitchell and Jessen. They're not here to answer that allegation themselves, but I do believe that a very small number of FBI agents later worked within the program and transferred over to the CIA temporarily to become CIA agents.
So you're suggesting that the FBI, or at least some within the FBI, were not quite the heroes that they've been made out to be in the popular press.
A very, very small number of people. And the other thing that concerns the detainee, the defence teams representing people who have been charged with 9/11 or other terrorist attacks and are at Guantanamo now, is the fact that none of the information gained from any of the detainees during the CIA period could be admissible in a military commission because it was obtained through torture. So they had to reinterrogate all of the detainees within a month or so of them being officially handed over to the Department of Defense in Guantanamo in 2006, although Mitchell and Jessen ran the prison. And some of the people who had worked, some of the FBI agents who'd worked at the black sites turned up to work on these clean team reinterrogations. So there is an attempt to suppress the whole 9/11 trial on the basis that these people were not clean. But this is a very small number of people.
That brings up a final question I wanted to pose to both of you, not as behavioral science experts, although it'd be really interesting to hear Andy Morgan's and Susan Brandon's thoughts about this question as well. So I'll ask it to you for the next panel right now, even though you're not up on the stage yet. And that is this: let's assume for a moment that the clean team players were completely different players from those who were involved in the torture at the black site.
Some of them definitely were completely different players.
Let's assume an environment in which all of them are. Is it plausible to say, and this is a central issue right now being litigated in the pretrial stage at the military commission hearings at Guantanamo, the argument that the clean team interrogations are sufficiently cleansing to take the previous torture these men endured out of the picture so that what they say in the clean team interrogation should be admissible. Is it plausible to say that, or is it the case that once these folks are conditioned to brutality, experiencing PTSD symptoms, ironically, insofar as Mitchell's argument makes any sense about conditioning, is it plausible to say that this can be completely put in the background, or is it the case that this conditioning is going to be more or less indelible to the point that the clean team interrogations can't be clean?
I think you could say learned helplessness probably lasts for life. And if you have an occasional reminder, or probably a very regular reminder that Jim and Bruce or other people are still out there, and they ran Camp 7 until 2009, and the guards and interrogators were employed by Mitchell, Jessen and Associates. There was testimony that came out in January 2020 of Ramzi bin al-Shib before he was sent for his clean team interview. None of the detainees explained what this process was. They were just taken one morning to meet some FBI agents. Ramzi bin al-Shib had to be taken out of his cell and forced cell extraction to get him down there. He was given psychotropic medication before his interview and after his interview. So the fact that even if none of that had happened, the constant reminder, the noisy fans, the cold, the replication of black site style living conditions were maintained to make sure that everyone was reminded of what their previous experience had been and the fact that it could happen again.
Why don't we, there's so much more that we could say about this and ask about this, but why don't we break at this point and bring up our final panel? And unless there's anything really pressing you feel you want to say right now.
Well, one thing I'd like to say is just remember that some of these people, detainees, are still detained. In the case of Abu Zubaydah, he's never been charged. All of the CIA allegations made against him have been disproven. He's never been given any opportunity to speak. He's still incommunicado. And so 20 years today, he was in the middle of being the enhanced interrogation techniques unofficially were starting on him in Thailand. And he has paid the price of 20 years in detention and no visible sign of him being let out.
And I'd also just like to call attention to the Searle Guantanamo Working Group and our 13 recommendations for shuttering the Guantanamo facility. President Biden needs to stand as an example to the world. Right now, we've heard from Ukraine about their struggles and about what Guantanamo is globally, this gulag, for lack of a better term, this symbol of torture, injustice, and oppression. And until we rid that, until we unmask the torturers, until we remove this cloak of invisibility over anything about torture, we will never be able to legitimately tell the Russians and tell the world that we adhere to the rule of law and basic human rights.
And we just heard the importance of that from Yuri Belousov. And there is some political movement on the Guantanamo closure question, and not just from Democrats. And we don't have time to plunge into it now, but I gather there's been some noise even on the Republican side of the aisle, some interest in this. Let's break. Thank you very much. So some brief intros. Susan Brandon is a former Yale psychologist and White House Science Advisory Office staffer during the George Bush years. She's also served as a senior American Psychological Association staff member and as the High Value Interrogation Group's research director. Susan is currently a consultant to industry and government on science-based investigative interviewing techniques. Charles Morgan, AKA Andy Morgan, is a former Yale neuroscientist, a preeminent expert on the neurophysiology of extreme stress, and the former CIA intelligence officer. Charles Morgan also led path-breaking studies of the hormonal and other changes that occurred in the blood and cerebrospinal fluid of men who were undergoing the most extreme forms of SEER training. He's currently a forensic psychiatrist and clinical professor at Yale and at the University of New Haven. And he's been retained as an expert in proceedings before both the International Criminal Court and Guantanamo's military commissions system. Jack Clunan is a 27-year veteran of the FBI's New York office, where he investigated members of the al-Qaeda network, including Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri. Several of his al-Qaeda interviewees became cooperating witnesses and later testified in numerous trials. Since Jack retired from the FBI, his team of global consultants has successfully resolved more than 200 kidnap for ransom and extortion cases. So he hangs out with some really nice guys, it sounds like. Elisa Massimino is visiting professor at Georgetown Law, senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and a former Robert Drinan Chair in Human Rights here at Georgetown. She served for a decade as president and CEO of Human Rights First, one of America's leading human rights advocacy organizations. And a personal note, her predecessor, Mike Posner, is the person who, when I was a student at Yale Law School eons ago, first got me involved at the interface between international human rights violation and medicine and the behavioral sciences. Colleen Kelly is a co-founder of the September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. Her brother, Bill Kelly Jr., was killed on 9/11 at the World Trade Center. Colleen has traveled to Guantanamo more than a dozen times to observe the 9/11 military commission process. And she meets regularly with both the prosecution and defense teams. And I thought I'd ask folks to just offer some initial brief reactions to what you've heard and seen so far. Reactions may be kind of, max of 60 to 90 seconds, brief thoughts, perhaps going down the line. And then we'll open things up to wider questions. And then Sarah Werner, my research assistant, will pose one or a few questions that she'll consolidate from the online questions. How about, let's see, shall we start with Elisa? Since you happen to be at that end of the table. That's how I made that decision.
Got it. Sure. Gosh, I have a lot of reactions to what we've heard already tonight. One is just the profound, bravery of Yuri Belousov and how much we all have to learn from the commitment to human rights and the rule of law in the midst of Russian atrocities. When we think back to 9/11 and the post 9/11 period, where this country so profoundly lost its way, a lot of what we heard back then from people, justifications were, you don't understand. It was, everyone was afraid. We were afraid of the next attack. There was so much fear. Well, I don't think anybody can imagine more fear than the Ukrainians are feeling right now. And in the middle of that, not 20 years later, where we're, in the comfort of peace, but right now, they're grappling with these issues of how prisoners should be treated and their commitment to the fundamental principles of the rule of law. And I just am so moved by that. And I think we have so much to learn from them. I know that we can help them, we can support them, but mostly I feel like we just have a lot to learn as Americans about the values that we hold ourselves up to.
Thank you. Colleen.
Yeah, I would echo a bit about what you said, Elisa. What struck me so far was Yuri Belousov. He said, it's difficult to persuade Ukrainian people that we shouldn't do what was done to us. And hearing those words, we all know what it's like to feel anger and rage as human beings. And it feels like the rule of law is specifically set up so that we don't behave and don't act according to those emotions, but we act within the guidance and the guidelines and guardrails of the rule of law. It's disheartening to see states and non-state actors around the world point to Guantanamo prison and point to the torture that was done at Guantanamo and say, look what you did, how can you lecture us? It's disappointing when terrorists like the ISIS Beatles who killed 4 people in Syria, when they were torturing the journalists and Kayla Mueller, doing the same thing to these journalists and Americans as some of the same torture techniques that were done at Guantanamo, and specifically citing that's why they were doing them. So I'm fascinated to hear everyone's opinion here, and also just to really think about how we can strengthen those guardrails in the rule of law.
Jack.
Many people perhaps don't remember, but back in 1996, there was a presidential finding that essentially declared bin Laden, Al Qaeda, and so on enemies of the state, if you will. And we were charged with, that is the New York office of the FBI was charged with investigating Al Qaeda and essentially building a prosecutable case against it, as odd as that may seem. So along with the attorneys from the Southern District of New York, we set about an investigation. And that led to us traveling the world, finding people who were members of Al Qaeda, in some cases the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which eventually merged with Al Qaeda. And we interviewed these people. And we interviewed them according to the law. And we gained their cooperation. And this book and what we've heard thus far brings back a lot of memories, a lot of painful memories. And I want to share one thing with you. The first time that I heard the name Abu Zubaydah. It was from a man who was described as bin Laden's chief trainer, a man who worked on the Encyclopedia of Jihad. And he said to me that Abu Zubaydah, because he was tasked by bin Laden to investigate Abu Zubaydah, because he thought Abu Zubaydah was stealing money. He was running guest houses. And this man said to me Abu Zubaydah will never be trusted by the Sheikh because of his birth, because of the country that he was involved in, and he doesn't have the intellect to do that. Now think fast forward, where we've been, what happened to this man, to Mark's point. This is a terrible tragedy that's befallen us. And lastly, I would like to congratulate Mr. Moore, who took a principled position years ago, a great risk to his professional position, and stood tall. If we had other people like him, and if the director of the FBI at the time was a cabinet level officer, I'm convinced that we would not have had these instances that we're all discussing tonight.
Thank you.
Andy.
You never imagine the course your professional career takes, but back in 1996, I wasn't tracking anything that was going on with respect to that. I was at the National Center for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and our mandate from Congress was to unpack the physiology, the neurophysiology, develop new treatments for it. And we all were firm in our belief that traumatic memory is indelible and it's accurate and it sticks with you for life. And Steve Colley, one of my colleagues, Steve Southwick, who passed away last week, we published a paper on memory in Vietnam veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, and found that, unlike what we'd all learned in medical school, traumatic memory is neither indelible nor fixed, which is a problem when you start bringing memory into the courtroom. And I testified at The Hague in the prosecutor versus Entopharyngia, and some of the key elements in the case were the witness gave 7 different eyewitness identifications, and the defendant morphed from being 5'8", blonde hair, blue eyes, to being a 6'4" Croatian with dark hair and fine features. And I remember testifying about PTSD, what we know about memory, how stress affects memory, and realizing we know nothing about, in a controlled trial way, the nature of human eyewitness memory and recall for high stress. I was introduced to the survival school program in 1997 and really had the only access with my team from Yale. And over the years, we looked at neurocognitive effects. And along the way, I met Jim Mitchell and Bruce Jessen. My quick answer to you about why he might have been believed is he was quite revered because it's a bubble, it's a cocoon when everybody works in the secret clearance world. And I think some of his ideas would never be accepted by the general scientific population. I met him very briefly. He wanted to show me a new thing he'd developed for predicting who was going to be super. And I realized it was ascientific. And I told my boss at Yale, Dennis Charney, I said, I don't want anything to do with him, or we won't get anything published. So I'll just be very quiet, nod, and leave. So he won't interfere with my study. So I was absolutely selfish. But along the way, we were able to see the impact of stress on memory. And the one thing I will say about SEER, it's this incredible training, and this is a point where I probably disagree slightly. The reason why the waterboarding was stopped, it was not done in everyone. Waterboarding was a sign that a student is failing to demonstrate what they learned in the classroom. It's supposed to be a negative feedback loop saying, excuse my language, you're fucking up. And if you don't, we're going to drop you from training. And at that particular point in time in the SF community, if you didn't pass SEER, you could not be deployed. And so the Navy was doing it, the Army was doing it, I was at Camp McCall. And it was seen as a sign that you are failing to show what you learned in the classroom phase, to learn what former POWs have always said is you never directly challenge the oppressor. You have to take care of the people under you and learn other ways of resisting. But I had to persuade my colleagues in science that this was as close as we could get to uncontrollable stress in humans ethically, even though they know the course is going to end. And so I was rather skeptical, but the long and short of it was the neurophysiology and the changes in cognition were rather profound, some of the biggest we'd seen in humans. And it's been on that basis we've looked at the impact of mock interrogation stress on memory, suggestibility, compliance. But the reason why I mentioned that with respect to Jim Mitchell is because I think that personally, I know he has a large ego, but his representation of the science is just absolutely wrong. His representations of learned helplessness and its effects, I mean, at core, if you really develop learned helplessness, you don't help yourself, which would be to tell the interrogator the truth. I mean, that's the fundamental notion in the model, is that the animal fails to rescue itself when it actually has the opportunity, because it's learned nothing I can do will make any difference, so why try? It's actually a pretty good model of PTSD and depression, but he really has misrepresented the science about it. So that's just the one point I like to make about SEER. We have always failed to demonstrate sensitization in humans at SEER, which I would have loved to publish on, as negative as that sounds. But there was a big fight going on between the Air Force and the Army and the Navy. The Air Force is the only program from which there's been documented cases of PTSD, and it was so light. I only did a study with them once because the neurophysiology and the changes weren't very big. But at the Navy and at the Army schools where the stress was much higher, there haven't been cases of post-traumatic stress disorder. So I was surprised by that. But it is an incredible thing, but I think people that I know in the SEER community were actually shocked by the misuse of it and then transforming it into something that really isn't what the training is about. But that's how I got launched into all this, and then discovered fundamentally I got sucked into the legal arena because memory, eyewitness memory, and testimony is at core the issue. Like now at The Hague, the same question you asked about, can neutral teams be seen as neutral? When the prosecution team or from the International Court go to interview people who are detained in horrible circumstances, they pretend that nothing else matters outside the room because they're not in charge of the harsh conditions that the potential witnesses for the trial will be. And my own view would be, I don't think you can separate them, but I don't know if the court wants to hear that. So I'm sorry, I talked too long, but there we go.
Thank you. And Susan.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think that there's any support for the clean team notion. I don't think there's been any research on it. It's something that we should investigate systematically. So, but it doesn't make any sense based on what we know about how people remember stuff. So as mentioned, I helped set up and manage a research program at the Hague. And what that research showed across multiple cultures, languages, and places, looking at real life interrogations, was that if you develop rapport leads to cooperation, and cooperation leads to information. This is rather, I think, a counterintuitive notion, because most people think that the only way you're going to tell a secret that you don't want to tell someone is if somebody pressures you to tell it and hurts you to tell it. I have the opportunity to train law enforcement occasionally. And one way I try to help people understand this is at the very beginning of the class, I tell them, okay, turn to the person next to you. They're usually men in these classes, and describe to that person your most recent sexual humiliating experience. And usually they just, there's a lot of silence in the room.
I'm not taking your class.
Yeah, there's every once in a while, there's the cop that turns around immediately and starts to talk. But anyway, but as an illustration of the fact that you are not going to tell somebody something that you don't want to tell them unless you have some kind of relationship with that person that convinces you that it's in your best interests, or because it's consistent with your value structure to tell that. I think that this notion that that interrogation means pressure, interrogation means, if not physical abuse, psychological abuse, is still very prevalent throughout the public, the American public, the American legal system, policymakers, law enforcement writ large, the intelligence agencies. It occurred to me watching the movie that it was interesting that Gowden and Soufan had elicited some information from Abu Zubaydah, and the headquarters, CIA headquarters, said, no, we need more, you need to put pressure on them. And there was this perhaps implicit notion that their methods couldn't work to get the real stuff. You had to interrogate. And interrogation means pressuring somebody, pushing them, instead of actually convincing them, as Mark was saying, cooperation versus pressure. So I worry that we don't want to spend too much time, however egregious the individuals were who were involved in setting up this program, lest we miss this larger challenge of institutionalizing the behavioral science that leads us to understand that if you want to know what somebody knows, you're going to have to treat them with respect. And there's no other way to do it.
I have a question principally for Andy and Susan, but I'd invite everyone on the panel to address it. After the fact, we can look back and with your powerful bases of knowledge and insights, we can see this, that James Mitchell was off the wall in his theory, not empirically grounded, et cetera. Even the weird evolution of his theory from initial talk about learned helplessness and Bitterman's work to the conditioning model suggests the off the wallness of it. We can do that after the fact. But in the moment, how do we manage the decision-making challenge and the legal challenge at times of crisis? The decision-making challenge and the legal challenge of distinguishing between the off-the-wall uses of behavioral science and medicine, and evidence-based concepts that can actually make a positive difference as well as a lawful difference when it comes both to national security and investigative interviewing for the purpose of criminal cases. There were lots of claims made in the moment that lawyers who went to fancy law schools and got good grades and did fancy clerkships then bought into, or at least pretended to buy into, for the purpose of writing fancy sounding memos. Nevertheless, we go back and we look at this, and it's pretty easy for me as a law teacher to quote from some of these memos and have the students be aghast at the nonsense. But in the moment, we fail to do that. So how do we structure a system so that legally and administratively, we can draw those distinctions in real time?
Well, I mean, that's how we met. There was a conversation in our professional communities about don't do this. We actually told Justin and Mitchell, do not do this. There's not support for it. NSF had sponsored one of the big meetings. And even prior to that, Bruce Jessen, while he was a psychologist out at the Air Force School, decided that in addition to his role of being a psychologist, he would play the role of an interrogator. And at one of the JPRA meetings, I believe it was 1998, it was the SEER psychology meeting for the SEER schools had every year. They had a big argument, told me he had to step down. He could not. That's when Gary Percival took over, because he said, you cannot wear two hats. You can't be interrogating a student and be the psychologist at the same time. And I thought it was very telling. He said, all right, I will be an interrogator, and stepped out of the psychology position. So there were signs along the way for these two, and there were signs in our community, but what could have been done more forcefully? Because you sponsored
such an interesting
incredible
question,
event.
because I was just thinking that, so the very influential book on how to persuade people, written by Bob Cialdini, the first edition was 1987. The cognitive interview that you talked about, this very, very powerful method of helping people remember stuff and tell what they know, that was published in 1992. Motivational interviewing, that is a powerful way of developing rapport. It came out in 1995. Yeah. Detecting deception based on science, 2000. Right? So the science was there, but the science wasn't available to the people that needed to know it, because the science wasn't present in Washington policy and Washington legal circles. When I was at the White House for a year and a half, I looked up in the directory. I was the only psychologist there, right? I think the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House still doesn't have behavioral science. There's physicists and there's attorneys, but behavioral science does not have a voice that is robust and authoritative and respected enough in the right domain. So if there hadn't just been 2 psychologists, if there had been 200, then you would have found some people who knew about all of the science that was available at the time. And the crazy people would have been drowned out.
Is there another breakdown? Oh, go ahead, yeah.
Can I interject? My real job is in healthcare where there's crisis all the time. And the reason that we have standards of care is for moments of crisis. So I point back to the Mendez principles that are being developed. When you have principles that are the standard of care, the standard of interrogation, you're not relying on crackerjack theory.
Yeah.
It's also not as
I really
sexy
want to
as-
second that. You know, one of the things that I personally feel like I learned from this whole experience of trying to end the torture program was that, you know, I've been a human rights lawyer my whole career. I'm all about getting the laws in place, and the science is important. I think, you know, after the pandemic, we all recognize how critical it is to trust science. But one of the things that I learned is that as important as those things are the guardrails and the ethics of the individual people. You know, torture was against the law. It was one of the first things I worked on in the early 90s was to get the US to ratify the Convention Against Torture, and that we made torture a crime in our domestic law. It didn't matter. And what mattered more than the law were people like Alberto Mora, who had a strong ethical core, and were willing to stand up for what they thought was right. And the law and science will take us so far. But, you know, Susan, you asked why after all of this, we still have this problem. And I think a big part of it, why people still believe that you have to lean on them, and popular culture, what people feel in their guts, what they see on TV, you know, all of our human rights reports and scientific reports are not as persuasive as what people are, you know, consuming. The show 24, 15 million Americans watch that advertisement for torture every week. Coming up against that is really tough. And I think as lawyers, and particularly law students, you should know that, the law is important, but lawyers can use the law to do a lot of different things, including some bad things. And so your ethical commitments and professional responsibility, it means more than you might think it does right now, where you're taking a test and all of that. It really can be your compass in these times of crisis.
Jack, any thoughts you want to add?
I'm not a scientist, and I'm not a lawyer. So the experience that I have is from sitting in rooms with the suspects. And I'm listening to all this, and I'm thinking, if I had to deal with science all the time to get somebody to cooperate, I probably never would have succeeded, because my brain just doesn't function that way. But the audience should know, those that are listening, those that are here, that if you agree to cooperate with the United States government and you become a cooperating witness and you're going to testify against bin Laden and so on, what does that mean? What does the United States government do for them when you agree to become a cooperating witness? We smuggled people out of countries. We smuggled their families out. We smuggled their children out. We got them educated. We got them health care. We got a heart transplant. We honored their agreement. Everything that we had to do had to be justified in a court of law. Everything that we did had to meet the approval of a judge. Why would I give a suspect his evasive rights when we're overseas? Why would we do that? We were criticized for it. We thought we're mamby-pamby. After 9/11, the reason why 9/11 happened was because there were people in the government who thought that we treated terrorism as a law enforcement issue. And if we hadn't, 9/11 wouldn't have taken place. That's not true. You've probably all read some of the 9/11 Commission. We don't have to go into that. But the ability to treat somebody as a human being, to gain their trust, to get their cooperation, doesn't happen overnight. It can take a long time. But once you build that level of trust and you honor what you've agreed to do, the subjects, feel an obligation to cooperate with you. And once they feel that obligation, they will not stop talking. So I appreciate everything that's being said here. I just wish, and I don't know how this program was ever conceived, this torture program. It's just so sad to me after all this time to sit here and have to listen to this, because it brings back a discussion on a secure line with a young agent in Bagram. He's got Ibn Sheikh al-Libi about ready to cooperate. I said to him, give him his advice of rights. What are you doing that for? I said, because something's going to happen and you're going to have to protect yourself. That's when a pickup truck pulled in with a plywood coffin in the back. And Ibn Sheikh al-Libi was being taken out to go to a black site. And Ibn Sheikh al-Libi said to that young agent, I know it's not you guys. I know it's the other guys. And we know who the other guys were.
Mm-hmm.
Threats don't work.
Thank you. Sarah, do you have perhaps a question or a loan or consolidated for our panel?
Is this working? Yes, it is. So
a quick out of the dark corner if you like.
I have the questions on my computer, so I will remain in the dark corner, but I will still ask the question. So a quick note to the audience, Yuri has had to sign off, but he left me a quick note. As he departed, he wanted to share his appreciation to everyone here for coming, and to Georgetown and everyone on the panel for hosting the event. And he reiterated his hope to hold the Russians accountable for all that they've done, and hopes that he manages to do so in a way that's in accordance with the rule of law. And then he also closed in emphasizing his wish that the U.S. take the lead in promoting standards and on human rights and getting rid of the wrong kinds of standards. So the first question that's come in from the audience is, what role, if any, has prejudice and Islamophobia played in fueling the atrocities committed, and where does that fit in conversations about professional ethics and in terms of interrogation strategies?
Anybody want to take a first?
I didn't quite hear you. Can you repeat the?
Can you repeat the question? Maybe a bit louder.
It was kind of just muffled, but yes.
The question.
There
it goes. Okay. The question was, what role did Islamophobia and prejudice play in fueling the atrocities committed? And where does that fit into conversations about professional ethics and in conversations about interrogation strategies?
Thoughts from anybody on the panel?
Sure. Well, I can say a little bit about that. I think it plays a big role in, it certainly played a big role in the immediate post 9/11 period, where there was, and beyond. I mean, we're not that far from the Muslim ban and, from the previous administration. But, when I was talking about popular culture, one of the things that we at Human Rights First looked at was the power of popular culture and how torture was being portrayed on television. And we actually did a bit of a study. We hired a bunch of interns to watch thousands of hours of television over the summer and worked with the Parents Television Council to look at the shift of how torture was portrayed on television. Before 9/11, there were very few instances of torture in TV shows, and they were all of the same kind. Bad guys who tended to be either, depending on the setting for the show, Nazis or criminals or Black or brown people, tortured the good guys, quote unquote, white Americans, and it never worked. And the good guys resisted and torture didn't work. After 9/11, that completely shifted. First of all, there was a huge spike in the portrayals of torture on television, and it was being done by the so-called good guys, white Americans, in shows where the people being tortured were Black and brown people, and the torture always, quote unquote, worked and saved the day. This was something that was incredibly striking and very powerful in driving and tapping into discrimination in American society and culture. And when we discovered this and confronted the producers of these television shows with it, you know, they didn't confess that they were racist, but they confessed that this was in many ways a kind of fulfillment of revenge fantasy post 9/11. And I think that's been very hard to eradicate. It was a pre-existing condition, obviously, in our country, racism, but 9/11 exacerbated it in a particular way that has been very difficult to shake.
Jack, this may be a little bit off topic, but not so much on the issue of Islamophobia, but what was the mood within the intelligence community after 9/11? We wanted to prevent the next attack. So the assumption was that perhaps there were so many people within Al-Qaeda that knew about these various attacks. But that's why we would have to go to the enhanced interrogation techniques, pull people off the field, pick them up in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and they would know something. But if you knew something about Al-Qaeda, you knew that there was Al-Qaeda. If I asked you how many people were members of Al-Qaeda, you know how many people were in Al-Qaeda initially? 72. 9/11 was done with $53,000. They were hard up for cash. They planned operations very specifically, and only a handful of people knew what was going on. So the idea that we would have to put people in these situations, bring them to black sites, we began with the wrong assumption. That they just didn't know, these people, what was going on, because it was limited. It was done by design. And I think that was a very classic mistake that we made. We assumed that everybody within Al-Qaeda knew what everybody else was doing. They didn't.
The only thing I was saying in addition to that, no, we were really divided inside the CIA about it. It's just not true that everybody was on board with it. This was a small group. Judy Phillips and I shared an office. This is a small group of people who got immediate access all the way up to the 7th floor. And the rest of us were told to stand down, including the head of the medical ethics committee. The word came down. This is going forward, period. So I think that I was fortunate in that I also still had a job at Yale. So I was like, I could speak out a little more than people who were hoping that their retirement would come through at the CIA, because if they fired me, it was okay, I had a different job. So I could be a little more vocal, but there were lots of people in the organization who were very distressed about it and trying to figure out how to confront it, how to oppose it. Same thing happened when before Snowden had done his thing. Lots of people knew what was going on at the NSA, did not feel good. And they were struggling with how do you express dissent when the leader of the organization has said, this is the good thing to do, this is what we're going to do. Yeah, so it was really quite difficult. It was, yeah. I think that's all I'm allowed to say. Yeah.
There's a psychologist named, I'm not remembering his first name, but Kennedy, who tried. And I think he was the author of a memo that kind of didn't get anywhere.
I can't say who was the author of the memo, but there were a number. Yeah. See, that's very hard.
Josh.
Yeah, I'll punt to her. Well, I think about how I can actually answer the question. I don't mean to be difficult.
I should have stayed mum about that.
Yeah, no, the CIA still monitors everything that I'm allowed to say and not say. And so sometimes I can't even say I don't.
We don't see that red blinking light.
There's no blinking light. Yeah, so I'll consider your question. Think about it.
I apologize for framing it.
I don't know anything about the memo, if that's actually the truth. But I think to the question and to your comment, Jack, is the extent of ignorance about what was going on in Afghanistan with that group, right? And if there were people that knew about it, their voices were not heard.
Well, you know, that's always the argument that I hear, that nobody knew about this. And the fact of the matter is that a lot of people did know about it. A lot of people did know about what Al-Qaeda was doing. But, you know, decision makers do what they do. And you follow orders. And those of us down the lower end of the chain, we do our level best. But, you know, do you mind if I, I'm looking around and I see law students. And I'm reminded of an evening when I was sitting with one of the cooperating witnesses who decided that perhaps didn't want to cooperate anymore. And we had just gotten his wife a medical exam because they were paroled into our custody and they had no rights. And they found that she had a precursor to cervical cancer. So she's in our custody and we have her treated. And everything turned out okay. She waved her finger at her husband that night and said, "You will cooperate." And I guess the moral of the story is don't ever underestimate the power of a woman.
Any questions from our in-person audience? After I see. I think you were first. So go ahead.
Hi, everyone.
Please identify.
Just stand up. Oh, I'm Rebecca Schaefer. I know Mark Fallon. I was on the steering committee for the amendments principles also. I know Susan and I don't know. I'm just thinking, you know, and Elisa, I'm so taken with so much of what you said about the representation of torture being a revenge fantasy. And I just don't know. And also describing the SEER program, it doesn't sound like a fear motivated set of actions. It sounds opportunistic, it sounds corrupt, and it sounds like an ideology born of a desire for dominance. And that the experience of 9/11, which I was here for, I was around, I was in college, and I came to law school because of all of the abuses after that came up during that era. And I mean, I don't think it was fear. I think it was humiliation and a desire for dominance and revenge. And I just wonder, Dr. Andy, and you don't have your last name up there.
Won't stay out.
Dr. Morgan.
It's a sign.
I just wonder from your studies of the SEER program, like, it sounds pretty messed up to me. Just like I'm not in the military, never been in the military. I've been in treatment for PTSD before. I know what that's like, you know, but
What was it that sounds messed up about it? It actually came out of the effort to keep people alive if they're down behind enemy lines.
Yeah. So does it work? That's what I want to ask you. Does conditioning work?
The N is small. Since Vietnam, we haven't had that many POWs.
Yeah.
So from a scientific standpoint, it's difficult. People will say it's taught them a great deal. POWs come and talk to the class on the big debrief day and say, so you were in a little box for 20 minutes. I lived in one for 3 weeks. And you found yourself being willing to give up information, but you should never do that. You have to take care of other people. So the many flavors they get in the mock POW camp a real POW will come and say, I lived in a cage for 5 years. You were in it for 20 minutes. You need to learn how to move beyond discomfort and still take care of your fellow POWs, learn how to communicate, learn how to support them. So most students come through and they love the program. They'll tell you it's one of the best training.
Like a trauma bonding thing?
No, it's not a trauma bonding. And I think that's insulting.
I'm sorry.
No, I'll tell you why. When we give them psychological surveys and ask them about their symptoms of PTSD, the rates are very low, but they will tell you that as children, they were higher exposure to sexual abuse. These are special operations men saying I had unwanted sexual exposure at a rate of 12%. And if they're willing to say that, but they're just not saying, oh, I dissociated a little bit, there's something wrong with the premise. In my field, people are assuming that they're all sick. They're not. The base rates of PTSD are 2%. And that's because of the selection criteria. The program is good and people can look at my data any way they want. There's no stress sensitization going on. There's no potentiated startle after the event. People will talk about later, they do have a nice conditioned response. They can remember what they were told. When they hear crunching on gravel, their mind will flash back to something they were taught in class and remember it. So it is learning by association under stress, but it is not post-traumatic stress disorder. And we did look at that. I've done that for 20 years. So people just haven't read the science about it.
Totally. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to insult your work or the SEER program. I don't know. I'm ignorant about that.
I was on the Department of Defense SEER committee. We take it really seriously. It's highly ethical. You have doctors that are there. You have psychologists that are there. People take this, and the instructors take it very seriously. And you don't see the Zimbardo effect. You have very responsible people playing the roles of guards. They're well educated. They're not there to hurt other soldiers. They're there to prep them, say, these are things you need to remember if you're going to stay alive, if you're captured. And here's the tricks the enemy's going to try and play on you, like building coffins and putting them out there for you to see, like they did to the Brits that were all retained. So it's an educational experience. And I think it's just wrong to frame it this way because it feeds into what this myth that somehow reverse engineering survival school techniques can elicit information. There is no information students at SEER are supposed to give up. They can throw away information, but it's not an information collection experience. It's to learn what enemies will try and do to you to exploit your team cohesion and exploit a US citizen. That's the irony. A program that's designed to show you what bad people do that break the Geneva Convention is what we turn around and did to other people.
Right.
But that's
right.
That's what the school's teaching them is you're not supposed to do this. This is what's not in the Geneva Code. But here's why people try these things. It's to have you give up hope or to break your bond with your other things and start guarding other prisoners. But
so I wanted to ask you also whether there was some.
Let me.
Oh, sorry.
There was one other question in the back, and I want to, since we have so little time, even if we extend, say, beyond 7:10. Go ahead.
May or may not even need the mic, but I'll take it.
But we need it for.
I got you. Hello, Zoom people. My name is John Hurlig. I am not a lawyer or in law enforcement. I am a sailor of all things. I also host a podcast called Seabird. Hi, Mark. There's a point to this, I promise, and I think it is at the core of this discussion, which I'm so happy to be a part of. I sail professionally for a living. Recently sailed a schooner from the East Coast of the United States down to Panama and through the canal. There's a point in this, which is I had just interviewed Mansour Adaifi before I left for my show. I had a copy of his book, Lost and Found in Guantanamo, in my possession with me during this 6 or 7 weeks that I was sailing. My politics, it was pretty clear right away, were very different than the politics of the gentleman who owned the boat, who was paying me to help him sail his large new boat down and through the canal. And the first night I was on that boat, over a little too much rum with the book in front of us on the table, we discussed it, and he was very opposed to my views about what we had done. And he was quite convinced that torture could save American lives and was worth it. Fast forwarding and making this long story very short, he read the book during these 6 or 7 weeks that we were sailing and came back to me after he'd completed it and looked at me and said, I was wrong. Torture can't ever be okay. I promise you, this is exactly what he said. It's not okay. I was wrong. And my question for all of you in the panel or Mark or anyone is this introspection is great and is important, but how do we shift the conversation out of the echo chamber and get the people like this who aren't here now to hear the relevant facts? How do we move the conversation outside of the circle of people who are motivated to have it and include those who are less motivated to have it, so that more people's minds can be, this is like, how do you start a video that goes viral? I don't know that anybody knows the answer, but I think the question is important because I have a feeling most of us here somewhat already agree. So my ultimate question is, who has thoughts on how this conversation can move out of the echo chamber and change public will, which will then impart change on how we conduct our affairs in the future?
I think, well, one quick thought I have, the very narrow lane that I deal with this professionally is when I testify. If the very basis of evidence in the courtroom is what a person recalls and what they say, their testimony, and we know that torture corrupts memory, then it undermines sort of the basis for, it undermines the very evidence that people are going to try and use to get people convicted. So I often find that that's what juries are really interested in, judges are interested in, is how do we know that what they have to say is true? And what do we do with memory as it changes? So from a neuroscience standpoint, my argument against any method that is may not even meet the standards for torture, but anything that's under high stress, is it has a very high risk of degrading the very evidence that you're going to hope to use to make a claim from a neuroscience standpoint. That's not the broader social issue, but from an integrity of human data, human information. That's where I would come from on it.
I think Elisa had an answer earlier on that's spot on here about popular culture.
Well, that's certainly one piece of it, is getting more books like The Forever Prisoner, movies, getting popular culture to put out a different message than was fed to the American public and the entire world during the post 9/11 period. Persuading people is great. That's awesome. We should try to do that as much as we can. But we also, as Colleen said, we need guardrails and we need to enforce them. We're lawyers. We know that, the law is one thing and enforcement is another. So we need to focus on enforcement and deterrence of people straying from those rules. And so we need to have accountability. Accountability, which you heard about from Yuri, is really important. Right now in Ukraine, we're talking, a lot of people are talking about the International Criminal Court and hybrid tribunals and things that are going to take a long time. Right now in Ukraine, they have people in custody who they know have committed war crimes, and they are treating them humanely, as far as we can tell. And Yuri's certainly committed to that, and are preparing to hold them accountable. And that can really be persuasive when people see that these are common human rights standards, universal standards that we all agreed to after World War II. Said this is the secret sauce about how to never go back to the Holocaust, never again. One thing we know is, we talk about never again, but the thing we know will happen again and again is that we will be tested. We will be tested. There will be other moments, sadly, in our future when we will have to rise to the occasion. And next time, in the United States at least, I hope that we do more like the Ukrainians are planning to do than what we did with Guantanamo and the black sites.
If Yuri Belousov pulls this off, that's going to be a lesson to the whole world. I just wanted to briefly recall a moment from early Guantanamo that underscores what Elise said. A long time ago, I had a conversation. I interviewed Paul Burney, who was a psychiatrist who wrote up with John Lesso the initial memo that became what Secretary Rumsfeld almost signed off on until Alberto Mora stopped him, at least for a time. And I asked Bernie why he did this. And he insisted to me, and I'm not claiming that I buy into his story or his explanation. I invite you all to question his credibility, but he insisted to me that he did it because a whole bunch of the interrogators who he was talking to were watching 24 and thought that that was the right way to do it because it worked on 24. And they were on their own, shall we say, freelancing. And he described a little bit of the freelancing that was going on, for which no one was ever prosecuted. This is pre-Rumsfeld, pre-Bernie Lesso memo, et cetera. And he said that he wanted to get out ahead of the curve and put this memo out there as, in relative terms, ironically, a guardrail compared to what these folks wanted to do since they saw it on 24. That's not a very satisfying justification for the memo, but it underscores Elise's point about popular culture. We said we have
Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to quickly add, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that what's the first thing that President Obama did when he came into office? What did he sign that first day? Yeah, executive order, and he's outlawing torture and so on. We're never going to convince people who believe that torture is going to get information, accurate information, to do something otherwise. They're not. So we shouldn't be naive about that fact at all, because there'll always be people out there who believe that torture works.
Time for one last question. Do we have, how's our online queue doing? Because we can, you got one? Oh, you don't? Okay, all righty, okay. Yes, there's two.
Sorry, I had one earlier.
Are there two people?
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so be really, both of you ask questions, but be really fast.
All right.
Hold it to 20 seconds.
I'm an LLM student at Georgetown Law in National Security and International Human Rights. And I had a question for Dr. Morgan, who mentioned earlier the selection of the EIT contractors. Systemically and within the culture of the CIA, do we have any evidence, or is there any reason to know that that process is going to be improved or corrected so that the true science is going to be behind the contractors that our agencies are hiring?
And your question also. Go ahead.
This question is to Mr. Jack Clunan. I was wondering your perspective about what changed fundamentally in law enforcement post 9/11 in terms of the strategies, in terms of particularly money, when blank checks are being handed out to whoever wants one to do whatever they want, black sites, interrogation, surveillance with NSA and all these kinds of, there's an enormous amount of money that went into it. And it just seemed like someone else made the point about opportunism. I know people personally in Afghanistan who had millions of dollars worth of contracts, who were cab drivers to build roads that they have no expertise in, but they were throwing those contracts out like candy. So I was wondering about the role that money ended up playing in the change in law enforcement techniques, strategies, all those kinds of things.
You want to address the
just the first clarification. No, when I was referring to selection, I meant two things. One is the selection of people who become Green Berets or become MARSOC or become SEAL Team 6 folks, and the base rates of PTSD that are very low. And the other is the screening of instructors who are going to be part of the schoolhouse. So if you're active duty, you might take a schoolhouse tour and then become one of the instructors for a block period of time before you move on and have to adopt a role either of a guard or an interrogator or the guy who runs the camp. Those are all active duty people who are working for the SEER school at the time. And those are all screened by the psych through psych testing and interviewing and looking at behavioral factors as well. Are they suitable to be running a schoolhouse like instructors? If you have a higher risk program, like a shooting range, you want people who are qualified, right? If they're going to handle firearms. So, but yeah, I wasn't referring to how the CIA was going about that. No.
We reinvented the government after 9/11. We created the Department of Homeland Security. We spent billions and billions of dollars. Some of that money migrated down into local law enforcement, whether it's equipment, training, and so on and so forth. Do I think it made a difference? Ultimately, I think there's some good things that were done. Do I think that there was excess? Do I think that some of it was wasted? Sure. Was there a lack of due diligence? In some cases, sure. I mean, there were stacks of money being thrown around in Afghanistan. People were playing football with it. So yes, there was the exuberance, the enthusiasm to not let this ever happen again dominated, and a lot of mistakes were made. But I think cooler heads have prevailed. I think that smarter people like we have here on either side of me have made a difference.
Thank you very much. Thanks to our panel and to our previous speakers. And we end on perhaps an indeterminate note with a chapter to be written, just one more chapter in a story that's probably as long as human history will be. I thank all of you for coming. I thank the wonderful staff here at Georgetown and at Penn Searle for putting this all together. And I'm thrilled that our IT that brought in Yuri worked out. My heart was in my mouth for that in advance. So let us conclude. Thanks to all of you.